Maxwell Graves, the billionaire CEO of a global tech empire, leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing on his lips as he glanced across the lavish restaurant. The room buzzed with chatter and clinking glasses, but for him this evening was nothing more than a game. He had seen it all: negotiations, mergers, and world-changing deals. But tonight he was here for something else. He noticed Lila Johnson, a quiet waitress, moving gracefully between the tables. The staff was invisible to people like him, but something about her caught his eye. He raised an eyebrow. She was the last person he expected to impress him. "Do you even understand what we're talking about?" he said, his voice laced with mockery as Lila approached their table. "I'm sure you've never heard of AI or quantum computing, have you?" The room fell silent for a moment, all eyes turning to her. The words stung, but Lila didn't flinch. She had heard them all before. This wasn't new. But tonight it was different. Tonight she would change everything. "Actually, I know a lot about it," she replied, her voice calm and steady. Maxwell chuckled, expecting her to stammer or back down. "Really? Tell me then, what's the most exciting development in quantum computing right now?" The challenge hung in the air. Most people would have shrunk away, embarrassed. But Lila didn't. She smiled softly, her eyes meeting his. "Quantum entanglement has the potential to revolutionize communication and encryption," she said, her voice clear. "And AI is getting closer to mimicking human intuition, especially in healthcare applications." The room went dead silent. Maxwell stared at her, his confidence faltering. Lila, the woman he had dismissed as just another server, was speaking his language, his world. She wasn't just a waitress. She knew more about the technology he dealt with every day than he had expected. He leaned forward, his smirk wiped away, replaced with a look of genuine interest. "Where did you learn that?" he asked, his tone shifting. Lila simply shrugged. "I've always been curious," she said, her smile never wavering. The energy in the room had changed. What started as an uncomfortable challenge had turned into a moment of realization for Maxwell. He had underestimated her. And now, in front of everyone, he could see it. She wasn't just a waitress. She was someone who had spent her life learning, observing, and quietly absorbing the world around her. As Maxwell tried to find the words to respond, Lila walked away, leaving him speechless, his mind racing. He had no idea how much he had just been taught by someone he had thought so little of. In that moment, Maxwell Graves realized the value of a person could never be measured by their job title or appearance. And Lila? She had just flipped the power dynamic completely on its head. Maxwell sat in his chair, his hand frozen midair as he reached for his wine glass. The room still buzzed with the sounds of clinking silverware and quiet conversations, but it felt distant to him now. He had just been hit with a realization that made his chest tighten. Lila, the woman he had so easily dismissed, had just challenged everything he thought he knew. A waitress. She wasn't just a server. She was a person who held knowledge, insight, and intelligence far beyond what he expected. It felt like a slap to the face, but it was a wake-up call. He hadn't been listening before, but now he couldn't stop hearing her words echoing in his mind. He watched her as she moved through the room, effortlessly attending to the guests, her movements graceful, her smile polite but reserved. She was calm, composed, the picture of professionalism, but now Maxwell saw her differently. She wasn't just a fixture of the restaurant. She was someone who had been observing, listening, learning, and he had missed it all. He could feel the unease settle in his stomach as he tried to push the thoughts away, focusing on his glass of wine, the smooth red liquid swirling inside. But Lila's presence loomed over him, and every time he glanced up, he couldn't shake the image of her calm, unwavering gaze. She had spoken with authority, with confidence. It was almost as if she had been waiting for a moment like this to prove herself, to show that she was more than what the world saw her as. And now, in the silence of the restaurant, with all eyes on her, she had turned the tables. Maxwell had been wrong about her. He had underestimated her in the worst possible way. As he tried to regain his composure, he realized something he hadn't before. People like Lila were rare. They didn't boast. They didn't scream for attention. They simply did what they had to do and made their impact quietly without fanfare. Maxwell's thoughts were interrupted when he noticed Lila moving back toward their table. She was carrying a tray of drinks, her eyes focused ahead, her expression neutral. She passed by him, and for a split second their gazes met. It wasn't an arrogant stare, nor was it an apologetic one. It was just calm. It was as if she had no need to prove herself anymore. She had done that already. Maxwell felt his heart skip a beat. He had to admit it to himself. He was impressed. And for the first time in his life, he realized that his usual sense of superiority had no place here. Lila was in a league of her own. As the night wore on, Maxwell couldn't help but keep his eyes on her. Every time she passed, he found himself analyzing her, wondering how someone like her could stay so invisible to people like him for so long. He watched as she continued to interact with the other guests, with the same quiet dignity. He wanted to say something to apologize, but the words didn't come. It was as if he were afraid that any attempt to speak would expose just how wrong he had been. Finally, as the evening drew to a close and the guests began to trickle out, Maxwell stood up, his mind still racing. He walked toward Lila, who was gathering the empty glasses from the table. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Lila," he said, his voice steady but tinged with uncertainty. She turned to face him, a slight arch to her eyebrow, as if she had been expecting this moment. "I just wanted to say, you were right," he continued, his words catching in his throat. I didn't see you for who you really are." Lila met his gaze, and for a moment, they stood there in silence, the weight of the moment hanging between them. Then with a small smile she nodded. "It's okay," she said softly. "Most people never do." As Maxwell turned to walk away, he felt a shift in his perspective. Lila had done more than just challenge his assumptions. She had forced him to confront his own ignorance. And for that he would be forever grateful. Maxwell Graves arrived at the office the next morning with a heavy feeling in his chest. The usual energy of his corporate world felt different today. The familiar hum of his assistant's voice, the swift meetings with executives, the crisp reports laid out before him, all of it seemed like background noise to his thoughts. All he could think about was Lila Johnson, the waitress from last night. Her quiet confidence had unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. He had met people like her before. Those who were content in their place, who didn't demand attention, but still left a lasting impression. But with Lila it felt different. She wasn't just some invisible person doing her job. She was someone who could change the course of an entire conversation without raising her voice. He couldn't stop replaying their brief exchange over and over in his mind. Lila had known so much about the very industry he dominated. But it wasn't just the knowledge that stuck with him. It was her ability to speak it without hesitation, without needing approval from anyone in the room. It was something he wasn't used to seeing. His world was one where power was spoken loudly, where influence was worn like a badge, and where success was measured in numbers and deals. But with Lila, success was quiet. It was in her grace, her restraint, her ability to stand firm without making a scene. The day passed slowly for Maxwell. He found himself drifting between meetings, his attention divided. He couldn't shake the thought of how he had judged her the night before. How he had assumed that someone like Lila was nothing more than a waitress in a high-end restaurant. He had judged her based on her position, her role in that moment. And in doing so, he had completely missed the person standing before him. As he sat in his office later that afternoon, a sudden impulse took over him. Without thinking, he grabbed his phone and dialed the restaurant where Lila worked. The call connected quickly, and a familiar voice answered. "Hello, Bayou Spoon, how can I help you?" Maxwell cleared his throat. "Hi, this is Maxwell Graves. I was at your restaurant last night." There was a brief pause on the other end, but then the voice came back. "Oh yes, Mr. Graves, I remember. How may I assist you?" He hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "I wanted to speak to Lila Johnson, the waitress who served me last night." The voice on the other end seemed surprised, but they quickly replied, "I will transfer you to her." Maxwell could feel his heart pounding as he waited for the connection. When Lila's voice finally came on the line, it was calm as always. "This is Lila. Lila, this is Maxwell Graves. I just wanted to thank you for last night." There was a brief silence, and he could almost feel her smile through the phone. "You're welcome," she said, her tone polite but warm. "I didn't expect to be calling you today, but I wanted to say that I truly appreciated your perspective. You know a lot about the tech industry and Well, I didn't expect that. Lila's voice softened, and for the first time, Maxwell heard a hint of something else. Pride, perhaps, or something more human. I'm glad to hear that, she said. It's not every day someone sees beyond the job title. Maxwell paused for a moment, reflecting on her words. I think I've learned more from you than from most of the people in my own circle, he admitted. Lila chuckled softly. I'm just someone who listens and learns. Everyone has something to teach if you're willing to hear it. Maxwell's thoughts raced. He had spent his entire life chasing power and influence, building empires, and yet here was someone who had managed to teach him a valuable lesson without ever saying a word. She had shown him that true power wasn't about speaking the loudest, but about knowing when to listen and how to act. He felt a shift inside him, a quiet moment of growth that felt foreign yet comforting. I hope I can learn more from you, he said, his voice steady now. Would you be willing to meet again? Maybe. Not in a restaurant setting this time. There was a long pause before Lila spoke. I think I'd like that. Maxwell hung up the phone, a small smile tugging at his lips. He had no idea where this would go, but for the first time in a long while he wasn't concerned with the outcome. He was just grateful for the lesson, and for the person who had taught it to him without even trying. As he sat back in his chair, the weight of the morning's realization began to settle into something more comfortable, something he hadn't felt in a while, humility. The following week, Maxwell stood outside the cafe, his hands slightly trembling as he checked his watch. It was still early, and the street was quiet, the world just beginning to wake up. He had never felt this nervous for a meeting before. Not when he was negotiating billion-dollar deals, not when he was about to meet the world's top CEOs. But this was different. This was Lila, the woman who had completely upended his perception of power and intelligence. He wasn't sure what he expected out of this meeting, but he knew one thing for certain. It was going to change him. As he stepped inside the cafe, the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee hit him. The cozy space was filled with soft chatter and the clinking of mugs. He scanned the room until he spotted her sitting by the window. She looked exactly how she had the night they had met. Calm, poised, and entirely unbothered by the fact that she was sharing a space with someone who had once looked down on her. Maxwell approached the table, his footsteps slower than usual. When Lila looked up, her expression was unreadable. But there was something else there, something that felt like she knew exactly who he was, and yet she wasn't fazed by it. She wasn't looking at him with awe or reverence like many people did. It was as though he was just another person in her world. Mr. Graves, Lila said, her voice steady like she was greeting a colleague. She motioned to the seat across from her. Please take a seat. Maxwell sat down, his hands resting on the table as he looked at her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Maxwell wasn't sure what to say. He had spent the last few days thinking about her, about everything she had shown him. Lila, he began, his voice a little rougher than he intended. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about how I treated you. She didn't interrupt him, her gaze focused, waiting for him to continue. I judged you based on the job you had, and I couldn't have been more wrong, he said, his words feeling foreign to him. You knew more about the world I work in than I ever gave you credit for. And I don't know if I've ever been more humbled in my life. Lila took a sip of her coffee, her eyes never leaving his. I didn't need to prove anything to you, she replied calmly, her voice almost gentle. I just wanted to be myself, to be seen for who I am. Not the job I do or the uniform I wear. Maxwell nodded slowly. He knew that, of course. But hearing it from her, hearing her speak with such quiet confidence, made him realize how much he still had to learn. I've spent my whole life chasing power, chasing success, Maxwell said, his voice trailing off. And it's funny because for the first time in a long time, I feel like I've actually learned something. I've learned to listen. And not just listen but really hear people. Lila's lips curved into a small smile. That's all anyone really wants, you know, she said softly. To be heard. To be seen for who they truly are. Not just for the roles they play. Maxwell felt a shift inside him. He had spent so long surrounding himself with people who thought like him, who operated in the same high-stakes world of business and power. He had thought that was the only way to succeed. But now, in front of Lila, he saw a different kind of success. It wasn't about making the most money or being the loudest in the room. It was about understanding, about seeing the humanity in others, and about humility. As they continued to talk, Maxwell felt his walls come down piece by piece. He had never felt more open, more willing to learn. And as the conversation flowed, he realized that this meeting, this unexpected moment, had already taught him more than any business deal or boardroom negotiation ever could. It wasn't just about power anymore. It was about something deeper, something more meaningful. And for the first time in his life, Maxwell wasn't afraid of the unknown. He was ready to embrace it. Maxwell sat in his office staring at the window, the sun casting long shadows across the city. The hum of the bustling streets below felt distant, almost like it belonged to another world. He had just wrapped up a series of meetings, but his mind kept drifting back to Lila. The conversation they had shared at the cafe had left a lasting impression on him. He had thought he was the one with the answers, the one in control, but in reality, he had been blind to what really mattered. Lila had shown him something deeper, something he had been missing for years. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tracing the edge of his desk as he thought about how much had changed in such a short time. The power he had always sought had never come with the clarity that Lila had brought. It had never come with the simple truth that sometimes real strength was in listening and understanding, and in seeing people for who they really were, not just for what they could do for you. As the days passed, Maxwell found himself seeking out those quiet moments. Moments where he could reflect, moments where he could hear his own thoughts without the constant pressure of business. He even found himself going back to that cafe, just to sit and think, though he never expected to see Lila again. But a part of him hoped she would walk through the door just like before. A part of him wanted to thank her again, to tell her how much she had changed his perspective. It was a Saturday afternoon when Maxwell got a call that would bring everything full circle. The voice on the other end was familiar. "Maxwell," Lila said, her voice calm and steady as always. "I was wondering if you might want to grab a coffee sometime this week." Maxwell's heart skipped a beat. He smiled, a genuine, unforced smile. "I'd like that," he replied, trying to sound as casual as he could. "How about tomorrow?" "Sounds perfect," Lila said. "Let's meet at the same cafe." Maxwell couldn't help but feel a rush of anticipation. He had been waiting for this moment, though he hadn't known it until now. The next day, he arrived at the cafe early, his nerves tingling with excitement. He ordered his usual, a black coffee, no sugar, and found a seat by the window. The sun was low in the sky, casting a warm glow over the streets. When Lila arrived, she was as composed as ever, her presence calm and collected. She gave him a slight nod and sat across from him, a small smile tugging at her lips. "I didn't think I'd see you again," Maxwell said, leaning forward slightly, feeling the weight of his words. "But I'm glad I did." Lila raised an eyebrow, her gaze thoughtful. "Sometimes life gives us second chances," she replied. "And I think you've been learning a lot more than you give yourself credit for." Maxwell's smile faded slightly. "I've made a lot of mistakes," he admitted, the truth heavy on his chest. "But I'm starting to understand that it's not about being perfect. It's about being open to change." Lila nodded, her eyes softening. "That's the first step, Maxwell. The second is actually following through." As they continued to talk, Maxwell realized just how far he had come in his understanding of the world and of himself. He wasn't the same man who had walked into that restaurant weeks ago, full of arrogance and pride. He wasn't the same man who had dismissed Lila without a second thought. And in that moment he understood something else, that the real power wasn't in the wealth or influence he had accumulated over the years. It was in his ability to change, to grow, and to embrace the lessons life had to offer, no matter how unexpected they might be. "I think this is the beginning of something new," Maxwell said, his voice steady and confident, but with a new kind of humility. Lila smiled, her eyes meeting his with a quiet understanding. "It always is," she said softly. "The beginning is where the real journey starts." And for the first time in a long while, Maxwell felt a sense of peace, knowing that his journey was just beginning. Maxwell stood at the window of his office, watching the sunset behind the city skyline. The golden light reflecting off the glass buildings below seemed to capture the sense of change he was feeling. It had been weeks since his meeting with Lila, but the impact she had on him still lingered. He had been moving through his life at full speed, constantly chasing more. More success, more deals, more recognition. But now he saw the world differently. It was no longer about the next big win or the next acquisition. It was about people. About understanding them, listening to them, and most importantly, seeing them for who they really were. As the days passed, Maxwell started making small changes. He sought out feedback from his team, something he had never done before. He made time to listen to the ideas and concerns of those around him, and he found that by doing so, his relationships with his colleagues deepened. He no longer felt the need to assert his dominance in every conversation. Instead, he became someone people trusted, someone who valued their input. It wasn't always easy, and there were moments when his old instincts tried to pull him back into the comfort of control. But with every step forward, Maxwell felt a little more liberated. The weight of the past, the arrogance, the pride, the isolation, slowly began to lift. And as he began to change, so did the people around him. His team responded to his new approach with enthusiasm. They felt heard. They felt seen. And as a result, the work they produced was better. More collaborative. More innovative. Maxwell had always believed that power came from having all the answers. But now, he understood that true power came from asking the right questions. From being open to learning, from embracing vulnerability, and from showing others that their voices mattered. One afternoon, as Maxwell sat at a cafe, reviewing a set of business proposals, he received a message from Lila. "Hey Maxwell," the text read. "I've been thinking about our last conversation. It made me realize something. Sometimes the people who change us the most aren't the ones who are the loudest or the most powerful. They're the ones who listen. Thank you for being one of those people." Maxwell smiled to himself, his fingers hovering over the keys. He wasn't sure how to respond. There was so much he wanted to say, but instead he simply typed, "Thank you, Lila. You've changed my life more than you know." He put his phone down and took a deep breath. He was no longer the man he used to be. He had learned from Lila that true leadership wasn't about being in control. It was about empowering others, understanding their value, and lifting them up. As he walked back to his office, he knew he was no longer chasing something outside of himself. He had found what he had been searching for all along. Clarity, connection, and the ability to truly see the people around him. Maxwell sat in his office, the weight of the day pressing on him, yet something felt different. He glanced at the clock. It was late, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had reached a turning point. The change in himself had been subtle, almost imperceptible at first, but it was undeniable now. His thoughts were no longer consumed by the endless pursuit of success or recognition. The drive that had once pushed him forward was no longer fueled by ego, but by something deeper, something more meaningful. As he picked up the phone to make a call, he remembered the first time he had met Lila. It had been nothing more than a chance encounter, a brief moment in time that had set everything in motion. But it had changed everything. She had shown him that real power wasn't about control, it was about influence. True influence came from understanding, from listening, and from seeing the potential in others. Maxwell's phone buzzed and he looked down at the message from Lila. "Hey Maxwell. I was thinking about what you said last time. You've really changed. It's inspiring. I hope you're seeing just how far you've come." He smiled at the words. He had always been the one in control, the one who led with confidence, but now, he found himself looking to others for guidance. For the first time, he wasn't afraid to learn. He wasn't afraid to ask for help, to ask questions, and to open himself up to new ideas. Maxwell leaned back in his chair, his thoughts drifting to the changes he had made in his company. He had started fostering an environment where collaboration was prioritized over competition, where voices from all levels of the organization were heard. The impact had been profound. Employees felt valued, and productivity soared. The company was thriving, but more importantly, Maxwell was thriving in ways he never expected. He no longer carried the burden of always needing to be right or always needing to be the smartest person in the room. He had learned that strength wasn't about proving others wrong. It was about recognizing that everyone had something valuable to contribute. And in that moment, Maxwell realized that the most significant change he had made wasn't in the company he built. It was in the person he had become. He had shed the armor of arrogance and embraced the vulnerability that came with growth. He had embraced humility. As the days passed, Maxwell found himself meeting more and more with people from all walks of life. He wanted to hear their stories. He wanted to understand their experiences. There was so much he had missed, so many perspectives he had overlooked, and now he was determined to make up for lost time. Lila had helped him see the value in these connections. He wasn't just looking for business opportunities anymore. He was looking for ways to make a real impact in the lives of others. As Maxwell walked out of his office that evening, he looked out over the city once again. The same city he had conquered in his own way, but now he saw it with different eyes. It wasn't just a place of opportunity. It was a place full of people, each with their own story, their own worth. And for the first time in his life, Maxwell understood that the true measure of success wasn't in how much you achieved, but in how much you gave. He walked into the night with a new sense of purpose, ready to make a difference in ways he had never imagined before. Maxwell stood in front of the large glass window in his office, looking out over the city. The skyline stretched out before him, a symbol of everything he had built. Yet, as he gazed at the buildings, he no longer saw them in the same way. He no longer saw them as monuments to his success. Instead, he saw them as reflections of his journey, a journey that had only just begun. The man who had walked into this city years ago, driven by a hunger for power and recognition, was no longer the man who stood here now. He had changed, and the city around him had changed too. It had become a place of opportunities not just for business, but for connection, understanding, and growth. Maxwell turned away from the window and walked back to his desk, his mind racing with thoughts of the future. He had spent so many years focused on the next big deal, the next step in his career, but now he realized the future was about more than just climbing the corporate ladder. It was about leaving a legacy of meaningful connections, of helping others rise to their potential. He had learned this from Lila, the quiet waitress who had turned his world upside down. It wasn't just her knowledge of the tech industry, or her ability to stand her ground that had left an impression on him. It was her humility, her ability to see the value in others, and her belief in the power of quiet strength. These were qualities that Maxwell had overlooked in his pursuit of power. But now they had become his guiding principles. As he sat down at his desk, Maxwell picked up his phone and began typing a message to Lila. "I've been thinking about everything you've taught me. You've shown me that success isn't about being the loudest or the most powerful. It's about understanding, about lifting others up, and about doing the right thing, even when it's not easy. Thank you for opening my eyes." He hesitated for a moment before pressing send, wondering what her response would be. The truth was he had never expected to learn so much from someone like her. But that was the beauty of it. Life had a way of teaching you lessons when you least expected them. And Maxwell was ready to embrace those lessons. As the days went on, Maxwell began to make more changes in his life and in his company. He started fostering an environment of transparency and collaboration. He reached out to his employees, asking for their input on important decisions. He no longer saw them as tools to be used for his success. He saw them as partners, each with their own unique perspective and value. The company began to thrive in ways it never had before. Maxwell realized that when people felt valued, when they knew their voices mattered, they were more engaged, more motivated, and more loyal. And that loyalty translated into results. He found himself focusing less on the bottom line and more on the people who made the business successful. It wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it. As Maxwell continued on this path of growth, he found that his personal life began to change as well. He spent more time with his family, reconnecting with the people who had always supported him, but whom he had neglected for far too long. He began to prioritize the things that truly mattered: relationships, integrity, and kindness. These were the things that would stand the test of time, not the number of zeros on a paycheck or the size of a bank account. He had found a new sense of purpose, one that was far more fulfilling than any business achievement could ever be. Maxwell sat back in his chair, his eyes drifting over the horizon once more. The city before him was still the same, but he was no longer the same man who had once been driven only by ambition. He had learned that true success wasn't about conquering the world. It was about conquering yourself, learning to listen, and finding fulfillment in the connections you made along the way. And for the first time, Maxwell felt truly at peace with where he was and excited about where he was going. Maxwell sat at his desk, reviewing the quarterly reports, but his mind wasn't on the numbers. His thoughts kept drifting back to the last few months, to the transformation that had unfolded within him and his company. It felt like he had stepped into a new chapter of his life, one that was less about achieving milestones and more about cultivating meaningful connections. The success he had once chased so fiercely now seemed secondary to something deeper, something that could not be measured in profits or acquisitions. It was about understanding people, their value, their stories, their potential. He had learned that true leadership wasn't about imposing control, but about empowering others, about fostering an environment where everyone felt seen and heard. As the company continued to grow, Maxwell realized that the changes he had made were not just benefiting the business, but were helping him build a culture of respect and mutual support. His employees were more engaged, more driven, and more invested in the company's success. And Maxwell felt a deeper sense of fulfillment than he had ever known. One afternoon, Maxwell received an invitation to speak at an industry conference. It was a big opportunity, one that could elevate his profile even further. But as he stared at the invitation, he found himself hesitating. The old Maxwell would have seen this as another notch in the belt, another step toward cementing his legacy. But the new Maxwell, the one who had learned the value of humility and connection, wasn't sure if this was the right path anymore. He thought back to the conversations he had had with Lila, to the lessons she had imparted in their meetings. She had shown him that true success wasn't about being the loudest voice in the room. It was about how you made others feel, how you uplifted those around you. With that in mind, Maxwell decided not to attend the conference. Instead, he called a meeting with his senior leadership team. It was time to shift the focus of the company, to create a new vision that prioritized not just profit, but purpose. In the meeting, Maxwell shared his decision. He explained that the company's mission wasn't just about innovation and market dominance, but about making a positive impact on the lives of employees, customers, and communities. The room was quiet as his team absorbed the shift in direction. But when the discussion turned to how they could implement these new values, the energy in the room changed. Ideas flowed freely, and Maxwell could see that his decision had inspired his team to think beyond the bottom line. They were excited, passionate, ready to take on a new challenge. It was in that moment that Maxwell realized the full extent of the transformation he had undergone. He had learned the true power of leadership wasn't in dictating a path, but in guiding others to find their own. As he left the meeting, Maxwell felt a sense of pride that had nothing to do with profit margins. It was the pride of knowing that he had created a space where people could thrive, where their voices could be heard, and where their contributions truly mattered. He was no longer just a CEO running a business. He was a leader helping to shape a legacy of kindness, respect, and empowerment. And as Maxwell walked through the office that day, he was filled with a quiet sense of satisfaction, knowing that the journey was far from over. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt prepared to face whatever came next.